It's quite remarkable that Ron Paul has been able to create this kind of movement. And what I think is interesting is that kind of like the sculptor who says that the statue is always embedded in a piece of rock, he just kind of needs to midwife it and bring it into existence. I think Ron Paul has tapped into something which has existed in large part in the sort of American subconscious. Certainly, if we look at our political history, we see a long line of people, libertarians especially, also a number of conservatives, and even some people who consider themselves liberal, who've been very critical of, for example, an imperial foreign policy, who have known that our banking system is terrible and corrupt. I mean, certainly there have long been liberals who have complained about, why our banking system is, something that's plutocratic and it concentrates economic power, and they're kind of right about that. But they're oftentimes wrong about what they suggest as the remedy. They don't realize that government is actually responsible for this concentration of economic power, and that you'd have a more diffused system without, a central bank and without as much federal regulation as we have. So I think that conservatives, libertarians, and even some liberals have always been out there who are willing to listen to a good message like this that Ron Paul has. But until now, nobody has been able to say it, and nobody's been able to break through into a media environment in which they can get that message across. Now, some people think that the Ron Paul phenomenon was an instant success, that it just happened in 2007, and suddenly people came out of the woodwork and said, "Aha! This guy has exactly the right ideas," and now we have a very large movement that's growing every day that is in fact trying to correct things. But it kind of ignores all the work that had been done, for decades earlier, setting up the pillars that would support this kind of a movement. So, for example, you had the great scholarly work that was done by people like Murray Rothbard, kind of erecting the philosophical basis for having this movement later on. And it took a very long time. Rothbard was always a populist. He always believed that the American people would come around to his way of seeing things. But it didn't happen so much during his own lifetime. Nevertheless, though, kind of like Moses getting right up to the edge of the promised land but not quite living to see it, I think Rothbard set up a foundation that would eventually bring Americans to what they needed. And throughout the 1990s and later on, you had websites such as LouRockwell.com and antiwar.com, which built up a very large following, certainly on the internet, but kind of even beyond it, of people who wanted to learn about these ideas of non-interventionism, of sound money, of peace, of civil liberties. And but also, if you look back even further, you'll see that there had once been a strain within the conservative movement that very much believed in these things. Austrian economics was profoundly important to inspiring the early conservatives of the 1950s. I mean, even people like William F. Buckley and some of the people around Goldwater were very much influenced by Ludwig von Mises. But for various reasons, that tradition kind of got neglected, and sort of neoconservatives later came along and deflected the conservatives into something that was counterproductive and that was the opposite of what their original tradition had been. And if you go back a little bit further, you find people like Robert Taft, who had generally non-interventionist views and who certainly had a great antipathy to invasions of civil liberty and to show trials and to the entire project of Americanizing the globe at the point of a gun. So Ron Paul has crystallized all this. He's a brilliant spokesman, and more important than just being a brilliant spokesman for these ideas, he has a consistent record that he can point to, going back decades. And that's important because as soon as people see the failure, as I think Americans generally have, of such as the George W. Bush years and now the Barack Obama years, when they see the disasters that have come to our foreign policy, when they see the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, and today, they realize, okay, something is profoundly wrong with the people in Washington. But what do the politicians do? They then say, well, gosh, you know what? You're right. I never believed in that stuff. I actually believe in freedom and liberty. I believe in getting rid of the Federal Reserve. They basically come up with a bunch of lies and say that they always had this less statist view. You see the liberals do that. Whenever there's a Republican administration, liberals will suddenly say that they're the strongest believers in civil liberties. Whereas in fact, when there's a Democratic administration you'll find that those civil liberties tend to be downplayed a little bit. And you find you sometimes have hate crimes legislation and other things, which would clearly be a tremendous violation of American civil liberties. Conservatives, unfortunately, are the same way. Whenever there's a Democrat in office, as there is now, or as there was when Clinton was in office, they say they're the greatest believers in small government. And then conservatism and libertarianism seem very similar at that time. But when there's a new Republican administration in power, all too often what has happened is that conservatives will then follow that administration into a more interventionist approach. Ron Paul, however, because he has this tremendous personal integrity and this record that vouchsafes for that, people see that he's the real deal. He's not some politician who's just coming along and saying, you know what, I oppose this failed policy and have crafted, the alternative to it. They're able to say, this guy opposed the policy even before it failed. This guy was opposed to central banking and the Federal Reserve and the abuses of our banking system long before the economic crisis hit. He saw it coming, and he was prepared, and he offered something that was correct as a remedy long before the actual crisis occurred. So too in foreign policy and in so many other respects. So I think that it's a combination of the right moment. It's a combination of Americans, because of the mess that our foreign policy and our economic policies have created, finally waking up and saying, we're in a situation that is unprecedentedly dangerous. And it's also a combination of things like new media and the fact that for a decade before Ron Paul ran, for the Republican nomination for president, you had organizations like LouRockwell.com, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and Antiwar.com, which had already gotten out a large part of the message that Ron Paul would be bringing into the political arena in a very forceful way later on. So I think it's been a combination of those elements that has really made the revolution. I think what's most interesting about the TSA trying to tighten security standards, supposedly, introducing new scanners and so forth, is that we've seen this happen time and time again, and each time the terrorists always find new ways to circumvent whatever security measures are put in place. It's interesting that the TSA and all these other government agencies that are involved like to harvest as much data as possible. So, right now there's been talk that if we have full body scanners that are basically X-ray specs looking through, your wife's clothes, your mother's clothes, your daughter's clothes, your clothes, etc., this will be displayed in a scan someplace else within the airport, and then someone's going to look at it briefly. They'll make sure you're not carrying any bombs, and then you'll go about your way. That information will be deleted, etc. But really, if you look at what government has done, they continually try to compile all the data that they receive into a database. They want to know all of your biometrics, basically. They want to know, ideally, your fingerprints, your retina scans, your DNA. In Britain, for example, they've had this thing developed, basically, over the last decade, where anyone who's arrested on suspicion of a crime, this is not people who are eventually convicted, these are simply suspects, have to give a DNA sample. And even if you're later acquitted, even if you're later, the charges are dropped, they still retain your DNA on file. And this has happened to just all kinds of ordinary people, and there's no way for them to get their information out of that database. I think we're going to see exactly the same thing happen with the TSA and with the transportation issues. Because what's going to happen is that the terrorists will once again find a way to circumvent whatever measures are put in. And then people are going to say, well, if only we had more data, if only we knew better, whether people who are 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall or whatever, whether people who, have certain kinds of body movements as they go through a scanner, whether they're more likely to be terrorists than others. It would be, obviously, racial profiling is something that is so controversial that nobody's going to attempt to do that. But the idea of profiling people on every other measure, body language and, other forms of biometrics, I think you'll see a big push to have more of that. So in fact, these scans of your body, au naturel, are going to wind up being saved and compiled into a database. And somebody at whether it's the National Security Agency or something else is going to be looking through these things very carefully, trying to compile data. Now here's what's funny about that. There's a natural sort of naive inclination to think that as long as you have more data, you're going to have more wisdom. That all these data points add up to something like a perfect picture that will allow you to plot a graph and decide exactly who has these attributes which line up with being a terrorist or someone who is potentially dangerous. But actually, look at what's happened with 9/11, look at what's happened with all the databases that have been built up since then, especially the no-fly list. And what you actually find is that we have so much data right now, the government is collecting so much data, that it's unable to process it. So, for example, the fellow who actually was trying to blow up this flight on Christmas Day, he was already on a terrorist watch list, but he got on the plane. Why was that? Because there was no way of sorting out the signal from the noise, basically. We had so many profiles about people who were potentially dangerous that we couldn't say, wait a minute, this one actually really is dangerous. He's not just an 8-year-old kid whose name happens to be on the terror watch list by mistake. The same is true even back to 9/11. Most of the 9/11 attackers had expired visas. These were people who should not have been in the country in the first place. But because our government collects so much data on citizens, on non-citizens who visit the country, on illegal aliens, etc., nobody was able to sort through this information and try to act upon it in a timely fashion. So really, instead of thinking that the more data we collect, the safer we will be, the opposite is probably the case. The better data we collect, the fewer but better data, the more likely we are to actually catch people who are already identified as being quite dangerous, as this fellow was. And there's no need for stuff that will scan through your clothing or that will otherwise invade your privacy and will otherwise turn you into yet another data point in some government database. There's no need for any of that. What we actually need is a lot more intelligence, a lot smarter analysis of the risks that we already know are out there.